250 years. For a quarter of a millennium, the words written on a single sheet of parchment have echoed across battlefields, courtrooms, classrooms, and capitals around the world. They have inspired revolutions, challenged kings, and shaped the destiny of nations. Yet in the summer of 1776, none of that was certain. In a sweltering room in Philadelphia, a group of delegates gathered beneath shuttered windows, knowing that what they were about to do could cost them everything. Beyond those walls stood the might of the British Empire, the most powerful force on earth. Its armies marched across continents. Its navy ruled the seas. To defy it was unthinkable. And yet, one by one, these men chose to do exactly that. They were not merely drafting a complaint. They were declaring a revolution. If they failed, they would be branded traitors. Their property could be seized, their families ruined, their lives forfeited at the end of a hangman's rope. But they signed anyway. As America approaches the 250th anniversary of that extraordinary moment, we return to the summer when 56 men placed their names beneath a promise and changed the course of history forever. This is the story of the Declaration of Independence. Long before there was a United States, there were 13 British colonies stretching along the eastern edge of North America. To many colonists, Britain was not a distant foreign power. It was home. They spoke the same language, traded under the same flag, and proudly considered themselves loyal subjects of King George III. But beneath the surface, tensions were beginning to grow. In 1763, Britain emerged victorious from the French and Indian War, gaining vast new territories across North America. Victory, however, came at a staggering cost. The war had left Britain buried in debt, and many officials in London believed the colonies should help pay the bill for their own defense. New taxes soon followed. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and other measures reached across the Atlantic, demanding revenue from people who had no representatives in Parliament. To British leaders, the taxes seemed reasonable. To many colonists, they felt like a dangerous violation of their rights. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," began spreading from taverns to town squares. What had once been grumbling frustration slowly transformed into organized resistance. Merchants protested. Newspapers attacked government policies. Crowds gathered in the streets. For the first time, many colonists began asking a question that would have seemed unthinkable only a few years earlier. What if Britain no longer saw them as equals? The bond between colony and crown was beginning to crack, and the fracture would soon become impossible to ignore. As the years passed, the growing divide between Britain and its American colonies became increasingly difficult to repair. What had begun as protests over taxes slowly evolved into a broader struggle over power, representation, and liberty. In 1770, tensions erupted on the snowy streets of Boston. A confrontation between British soldiers and an angry crowd ended in bloodshed when troops opened fire, killing 5 colonists. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Patriot leaders quickly transformed it into a symbol of British oppression, spreading accounts of the event throughout the colonies. 3 years later, Parliament introduced the Tea Act, granting special privileges to the East India Company. Many colonists saw it as yet another attempt to assert control. On a cold December night in 1773, men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the dark water below. London responded with fury. The British government imposed a series of punitive measures known by the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was closed. Local self-government was restricted. British authority tightened its grip. Rather than isolate Massachusetts, the punishment united the colonies. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the first Continental Congress, determined to coordinate resistance. The argument was no longer about a tax on paper or tea. It had become a battle over who held the right to govern. By 1775, words and petitions were losing their power. The next chapter would be written with gunfire. By the spring of 1775, the air in the colonies was thick with anticipation and fear. Armed militias trained in fields and behind barns, preparing for a conflict many still hoped would never come. Yet both sides understood that patience was running out. On the night of April 18th, British troops quietly marched out of Boston, heading toward Concord, with orders to seize colonial weapons and arrest resistance leaders. But word of their movement spread quickly through a network of riders and church bells, alerting the countryside. At dawn in Lexington, a small group of militiamen stood on the green. No one knows who fired first, but in moments, shots rang out, and several colonists lay dead on the ground. The war had begun. The British continued to Concord, only to find that much of what they sought had already been moved. As they retreated back toward Boston, colonial militias struck from behind trees, stone walls, and narrow roads. The disciplined ranks of the British Army suddenly found themselves under relentless fire from invisible enemies. The fighting at Lexington and Concord spread like wildfire through the colonies. What had once been scattered unrest was now full-scale war. George Washington would soon be appointed to lead a fledgling Continental Army, but at this moment, there was still no formal declaration of independence. The colonies were fighting, but not yet deciding what they were fighting for. The break with Britain had begun, but the reasons would soon have to be written down. In the early days of the war, the colonies were united in resistance, but divided in purpose. Many still saw themselves as loyal subjects of the British Crown, pushed reluctantly into conflict. Independence was not yet the common goal it would become. Then, in January 1776, a small pamphlet appeared in print and began circulating through towns, taverns, and assembly halls. It was called Common Sense, written by a little-known political writer named Thomas Paine. Its message was blunt, direct, and impossible to ignore. Paine argued that monarchy itself was unnatural, that hereditary rule was a relic of corruption, and that the colonies had no reason to remain bound to a distant king. He did not ask politely. He challenged the entire foundation of British authority. Thomas Paine. Unlike formal speeches or political essays, Common Sense was written for ordinary people. It spoke in plain language, cutting through tradition and loyalty with sharp clarity. It spread rapidly, read aloud in public gatherings, and passed from hand to hand. Almost overnight, the idea of independence shifted from radical fantasy to urgent possibility. Public opinion began to turn. Delegates in the Continental Congress could no longer ignore what was forming beneath them, a population that was no longer asking for reconciliation, but for separation. The war had begun on the battlefield. Now it was beginning in the mind of a nation that had not yet been born. By the summer of 1776, the question was no longer whether the colonies were at war with Britain. That had already been decided on the battlefield. The real question was what they now were and what they would become. Inside the Continental Congress, tension filled the chamber in Philadelphia. Delegates debated not only strategy, but identity itself. Was this still a rebellion within the British Empire, or the birth of something entirely new? A committee was formed to give shape to that answer. Among them were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a young Virginian known for his writing, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was chosen to draft the document that would explain to both king and world why separation was necessary. He worked in quiet rooms, surrounded by papers, books, and the growing weight of history. Ideas from Enlightenment thinkers, legal arguments, and revolutionary philosophy were woven together into a single, carefully structured statement. He was not merely writing complaints. He was defining a new political language, built on natural rights, equality, and the consent of the governed. Meanwhile, Franklin and Adams reviewed and revised, shaping the language with experience and precision. Every word carried consequences. Every sentence risked war, punishment, or recognition. Benjamin Franklin. When the final draft was presented, it was more than ink on paper. It was a declaration that could not be easily taken back. Now, it had to survive the most dangerous test of all, agreement. Philadelphia pressed hot, and still under the weight of summer. Inside Independence Hall, the air felt even heavier, thick with disagreement, exhaustion, and consequence. Outside, the world carried on, unaware that a decision was about to be made that would redraw its future. The draft of the Declaration had been read, debated, and marked with changes. Every phrase carried tension. Some delegates wanted stronger language. Others feared what full separation would unleash. But the tide had turned too far to retreat. One by one, the colonies voted, not with celebration, but with gravity. What they were deciding was not symbolic. It was irreversible. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted in favor of independence. On July 4th, the wording of the Declaration was officially adopted. The document that explained the decision was now complete. John Adams. Yet even in that moment, there was no thunderous celebration inside the hall. There was only the quiet understanding that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Copies of the document were rushed to printers. Messengers carried it across the colonies. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in towns and cities to hear it read aloud. For many, it was the first time they fully understood what their leaders had committed to. War was no longer a possibility. It was now the price of independence. The Declaration of Independence was complete, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. When the ink dried in 1776, the names on the Declaration belonged to men who had risked everything. Some would lose their homes. Others would see their fortunes destroyed. A few would not live to see the war's end. The price of signing was never abstract. It was personal, immediate, and unforgiving. Yet the gamble held. The colonies survived the war. A new nation emerged from fire and uncertainty, shaped by ideas that once felt dangerous to speak aloud. Over time, the Declaration outlived the conflict that created it. It became more than a statement of separation. It became a reference point for liberty itself. United States Declaration of Independence. Now, 250 years later, the world that document helped shape is almost unrecognizable. Cities rise where frontier once stretched. Nations that did not exist now echo its language of rights and freedom. Its influence has traveled far beyond the original 13 colonies. In 2026, as the United States approaches its 250th anniversary, the Declaration is not a relic behind glass. It is still argued over, still quoted, still challenged, still invoked, because the question it asked in 1776 was never fully finished. What does it mean for a people to govern themselves, and what price are they willing to pay to remain free? 2.5 centuries later, the answer is still being written.